Buenos dias. These are the brave people here for the morning plenary of the final day of the Unity Summit. Welcome. I'm Ben Francisco Mobek. I'm the president of Funders for LGBTQ Issues.
And I'm Dennis Querin. I'm the president of the Neighborhood Funders Group.
And we're very excited to kick off, to kick off this final day with a plenary on addressing criminalization and policing of our communities. Whether it's the killing of unarmed black men or the continuing violence against transgender women of color, unfortunately, in this area of work, the grassroots and we as funders need to be extremely responsive to rapidly changing events and conditions on the ground. And I'm very proud that several of the change groups have done exactly that, have created spaces for funders to come together, often quickly in the face of quickly changing circumstances, and stay informed and coordinate our efforts and our funding as these issues come up all across the country in unexpected places. I in particular want to give a shout out to ABFI and its Black Social Change Funders Network, which has done really important work in this area. And to Neighborhood Funders Group and its Funders for Justice program, which is a network of now 450 funders concerned about the criminalization of our communities. In particular, shout out to Lorraine Ramirez, the program coordinator of Funders for Justice, who is sort of the architect of this conversation that we're about to have today.
So whether you're queer, you're trans, you're black, you're native, you're Muslim, immigrant, Latinx, Asian, you have undoubtedly felt that you are othered and excluded at some point in our current society. This experience of othering is related to the culture of criminalization in this country. In our society, we've centered punishment and incarceration as our way of addressing problems in the society instead of facing problems, resolving them, and healing as individuals and communities. This is the wrong center. As you listen to the experts on the panel, ask yourself today, what would it look like if all of a sudden prisons and incarceration as we know it didn't exist? In what ways would that force our society to resolve our problems differently? How might that strengthen our collective community? How would communities and individuals heal from trauma? So please think about those things. Listen to our experts. They have a lot of important things to share. And I want to turn this over to Aliyah Bakivon to kick us off. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Aliyah Bakivon, and I'm the founding director of the Criminal Justice Initiative, CJI, as it's better known. I want to thank you so much for being here. And before we begin, I would like to ask us to take one moment to think about all of your ancestors behind you that went through incredible experiences, made unimaginable sacrifices, and endured unbearable injustice for us to be here. Thank you. When we talk about criminalization, often we are focused on what's happening right now in terms of how many people are being raided and who's being put into a jail or a prison or a detention center. And I think it's very important for us to recall that how we got here is not something that we arrived at by mistake. And how we got here is not a simple series of misunderstandings. Whether you're indigenous and were here when the trouble came, or you're African and the trouble met you and brought you here, or you were from another part of this continent and the border landed on you, or whether you were not the definition of what someone called a man or a woman, or you were attracted to someone that other people were uncomfortable about, or whether you were a woman and someone just wanted your power and your land, or your control of your children or your body, we are here because some folks in power decided that they wanted to control other folks. They wanted to have what they had, and they wanted to tell them what to do with that which they had. So we are here, therefore, on the backs of our ancestors. And that is an important acknowledgement for us to make before we start the conversation around how important it is for us to work together, and how it is that criminalization has the many faces that it has. Because one thing that we learned, if not in the decades, if not in the centuries before this moment, one thing we learned within this last year is that if we do not work together, we are doomed. If we do not work together, we will not win, and we must win. So I just want us to recall this as we move forward and we think about criminalization in our various communities and how it affects us and how significant and important and urgent it is for us to work together. Because you will all recall, I'm sure, a very important poem where it said, first they came for, and I don't even have to tell you which one to put in that box, because whatever community you're part of, think of the community that you're not part of and you put them in that box. First they came for them, and I said nothing because I wasn't one of them. And then, eventually, they came for me. Right now, they're coming for us all. Thank you. So first we have Julia Vetti. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I think I'm mic'd, so here, why don't we get this? My name is Julia Beatty. I'm the program officer for the Black-Led Movement Fund at Borealis Philanthropy. And I have the honor of being able to support a constellation of organizations that make up the Movement for Black Lives, which was born out of the uprising in Ferguson and St. Louis, Missouri, in the aftermath of the murder of Mike Brown. This movement is something that catalyzed a new conversation around race, around policing, around state violence, and also, I would have to say, a new conversation even within philanthropy. The fact that we're using frameworks of anti-Blackness and white supremacy is a direct result of the organizing of the incredible and bold leadership of Black folks on the ground, who are not only just Black folks, but Black folks who are queer, who are young people, who are gender nonconforming and trans, who are immigrant, who are undocumented, and who are women. And I'm proud to represent that work today.
Thank you. And to her right is Gina Womack.
Good morning. My name is Gina Womack, and I am the co-founder and executive director of Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children. I also have the pleasure and the privilege to work with, run a statewide multi-generational membership-based organization of families, young people, parents, and others who support the ending the mass incarceration of children. So we have been working for the last 16 years. We just celebrated our 16-year anniversary this month. We have been working to close prisons, reforming and ending the school to prison pipeline, and building community through leadership development. We're moving into intergenerational structure. So we have youth groups that have emerged, Black Man Rising. Hopefully many of you had an opportunity to see them on yesterday, and the newest youth group, Black Girls Rising. And so hopefully you all will be introduced to them soon and very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. And to our right, we have another CJI grantee. Dago.
Yeah, hello everyone, good morning, buenos días. My name is Dagoberto Bailon, and I am from Phoenix, Arizona with Transqueer Pueblo. I wrote something, but then I lost the note, so I'm just going to wing it. So we are an LGBT migrant organization and LGBT people of color organization, right? That focuses on making sure that we are providing basic resources for or undocumented and people of color communities in Arizona. In Arizona, right, in the hostile environment, we've seen that a lot of the anti-immigrant, anti-LGBT legislation has been tested there, and now it's trying to be implemented across the nation. And so there is a lot of need for, there was a need for a space where people could just get together, people of color, right, and really just talk about whatever they needed. And I think for us, it is important, one, to address the basic needs like family acceptance, economic justice, defense and liberation, right? So we work with people inside and outside of the detention centers to make sure that they're adjusting their immigration status. We work with a queer politics track, like really figuring out, right, as queer, trans, undocumented individuals, how does it look like to shift political power when you can't vote? And we also work in health justice. And so that is to say, right, that when we think about criminalization, it is important to really take a holistic view because it's not enough just getting our people out of detention centers or out of jails. We need to make sure that we're supporting their everyday needs, or else they're going to fall back into that criminal system. And so we are there to make sure that we're supporting those people who are coming out.
Thank you.
Right on.
Thank you. And to the right, George Galvis from Courage.
Good morning, relatives. Humbled to be here with each and every one of you. I have the distinct honor of working with young people just like myself. I was incarcerated when I was 17 years old and charged with multiple felonies. And the organization I work with, our mission is to elevate the voice and power of formerly incarcerated youth, young adults, and their family members. We were born out of the gang injection organizing in Oakland, California. As of my staff were defendants in the Oakland gang injunction. And as of March 2015, we became the first community organizing effort in the nation to fully defeat a gang injunction when all gang injunctions were lifted and cases dismissed. Thank you. Yes, clap it up to that. And moving on from there, we decided to really kind of look at some of the roots of criminalization of young people of color in California, and looked at Proposition 21. And Prop 21 did a whole lot of things, but one of the things that it did is it allowed district attorneys to charge young people as young as 14 years old and directly file them as adults, right? That's like a conflict of interest. So, so we co-authored Proposition 57. That was a For Us, By Us initiative. I know that Governor Brown and many others have taken credit, and they certainly participated, but don't get it twisted. That was a For Us, By Us, formerly incarcerated folks helped co-author Proposition 57, and I was honored to be one of those co-authors. And so we took away the right of district attorneys to do that, and now we're going. Now we're ending adultification of young people. We're going after just the treatment of young people being charged as adults. Period. Whether a judge makes that decision or anybody else, and we want to close youth prisons and build youth leaders. So that's a little something about me. Thank you for having me.
And to his right, Arjun.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Arjun Sethi. I'm with the Security and Rights Collaborative. The Security and Rights Collaborative is a funder of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian community organizations and national organizations who work every day to combat criminalization, securitization, and hate. I specifically am a consultant with the organization, and I and a few others were brought on immediately after the election of Trump to help provide rapid response support in the forms of complementing, supplementing existing work, coordinating a response, and I also have faculty privileges at Georgetown Law School and Vanderbilt.
Thank you so much. This is an impressive panel working on the front lines. So we have some questions. Given the different ways communities are criminalized, what resistance work is happening, and what does healing justice look like in your community? Healing justice. Okay, go on.
Sure. Well, I got my, yeah, I'm good. So for Black communities, the movement for Black Lives is a continuation of a more than 400-year freedom struggle for liberation and freedom from control of our bodies, of our lives, from state violence. And so the movement really represents sort of a newly emerging, component of that work. So resistance around criminalization and state violence has always been part of our legacy. And, around the country, and I know, folks here who are actually doing this work on the front lines around criminalization in schools and policing, our communities are over-policed, they're under-protected, and they're under-resourced. Black kids are attending schools where they're pushed off onto an academic track into prison. A lot of the work that Gina's doing is trying to derail that. Every year, 3 million students are being expelled from school or suspended for the types of behaviors that are normal child or adolescent behaviors that white children are not disciplined at all for. So resistance for the movement for Black Lives, the work that I'm really honored to be able to support, again, is a continuation of this long struggle. But also, I would like to say that the movement is offering a really bold vision for resistance against state violence and criminalization. And in August of 2016, the Movement for Black Lives released a very powerful vision for Black lives that calls for the radical transformation of our criminal justice systems and disinvestment for policing. And I just want to sort of just offer some of the demands that the movement has offered for us to think about in our policy work as we're really looking to seek to transform these systems. The first is an immediate end to the criminalization and dehumanization of Black youth across all areas of society, but not limited to our nation's justice and education systems, social service agencies, and even media and pop culture. So this means an end to zero tolerance policies that feed the school to prison pipeline, arrest of students, the removal of police from schools, and the reallocation of funds from policing into the actual kinds of restorative services that keep our communities safe. Policing, law enforcement has never kept our communities safe, right? The movement is calling for an end to capital punishment, an end to money bail, fines and fees, defendant-funded court proceedings, also an end to the use of past criminal history to determine eligibility for social services, housing, employment, funding for education. And because the movement is centering marginalized communities within Black communities, undocumented folks, queer and trans folks, the movement is calling for an end to war on immigrants, an end to all deportations, immigrant detention, ICE raids, and an end to war on Black, trans, queer, and gender nonconforming people, including the addition of these communities to anti-discrimination policies to ensure that queer, trans, gender nonconforming Black people have access to employment, health services, housing, and education. An end to the surveillance of and targeting of Black communities. One of the things that movement leaders are seeing now on the ground is hyper-surveillance of their movements by law enforcement. Not just white supremacists, but law enforcement, right, are targeting our folks who are just really coming out and putting themselves out on the streets to fight for what's right. The demilitarization of law enforcement, and an end to the privatization of police, prisons, jails, probation, parole, food, phones, and all other criminal justice related services. So, the vision for the movement around criminalization and policing and transforming this is, really a world where cages are no longer used to control our bodies, right? Like, we come from a legacy, we are people who were stolen from Africa, brought here in bondage, right? Who really, the basis of all of the wealth that we are moving here in philanthropy today is on the backs of stolen Black bodies and our exploited labor. So, the movement really is calling for a radical retransformation of what this looks like, but until, right, like we no longer have cages that are barring us, right, an immediate change in the conditions in jails, detention centers, youth facilities, closing down youth facilities. I just got this great shirt from Courage. Close youth prisons, build youth leaders, and making sure that we have effective measures to keep all Black folks, particularly Black, queer, undocumented women, young people, safe and free from harm.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let you continue, Gina, but we're just focusing right now on what does healing justice look like in our communities. So obviously, some of the things that Julia Beatty was mentioning have to do with general justice in our communities, right? We can't be healed as long as we're constantly in the midst of the struggle, right? We're constantly being oppressed, we're constantly being criminalized, we're constantly being arrested, we're constantly being harassed, we're constantly being shot and killed, we're constantly being beaten. That is not the setting for healing. So we realize that we have to have justice to have healing, but we also know that in the midst of the struggle, we've got to also tend to ourselves. We've got to take care of ourselves. We've got to heal our communities. We've got to find opportunities for us to share. So Gina, I know that you've been doing this work, and Flick basically put the concept, the terminology that you have for school to prison pipeline was basically crafted by Flick. Flick is 16 years old, CJI is 16-year-old. Flick was our first grantee, one of our first grantees. So you put that on the map, and you're continuing to lead that struggle. Could you tell us what healing looks like in those communities, with those parents, with those students who are dealing on the front lines of that work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, healing is actually, and hopefully this will answer the question, but it's not separate. It's a part of the work, right? Because unfortunately, our families are constantly being attacked from the school, the housing, whatever, what have you. And so what it looks like, I thought I'd tell a quick story. So last year, and it was just really hard to find one story to be able to tell, so I'll probably tell another one later. But last year we had a 5-year-old that was suspended from school for stealing a chopstick doing arts and crafts. So not only once, they said he stole it 3 times. So that would beg you to ask the question, how could that happen 3 times? And it turned out it was the teacher's chapstick. And as it turns out, she's not even supposed to have a chapstick in school because it's medicinal. But that aside, that was the only way that they felt they could handle this young man, this 5-year-old, this baby.
Yeah.
So the mom, distraught, didn't know what to do. Someone gave her our information, so we came in to support her. What is it that she wanted to have happen? And she was like, I need to have due process. Of course, they denied her that in so many different ways because they didn't, rescind the suspension. She couldn't get a meeting, so forth and so on. So we worked with her to figure out what it was and how to try to get this removed. And just to say how hard healing is and to find a space, because you have to deal with this ridiculousness inside the schools that, So we sent a letter and explained to the school about the school prison pipeline, and we can't have you tracking this baby. This just makes no sense. It took us a while. They didn't adhere to the letters, so we went back to have a meeting. And so the work inside Flick is we're going to do whatever it takes. So we have friends that we can call upon. And all of this is just really part of a healing process that you can go to the community, that you don't have to accept this, that it's like, oh, we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that this child will not be tracked through the school to prison pipeline, and that the schools realize, and it's cathartic. Otherwise, you're just bogged down knowing that you have no options. But having options to be able to know that you can now fight the system, for us is definitely a healing process. And so we did actually, went real road deep in all kind of ways. We had friends, we brought therapists with us, an attorney. They tried to fight that because it's like, oh, now if you have an attorney, that makes it legal. We had to go through a whole process to let them know, no, this wasn't a legal situation at this moment. This is the community that we have to support our families and young people. And we rolled in, helped them develop an IEP, which they're supposed to do, but that doesn't happen. So holding a system accountable is really, it's just like really cool to help us feel a lot better that we can actually take up this cause. Needless to say, it took us 4 months. We literally had to go to the board meetings and kind of get kicked out, and that, we're going to keep this going. And the board chair finally said, after Googling us, right, and said, oh, I know this group we need to take this off. So the mom, the process for her was like, oh my God, to know that how good it was for her and healthy it was for her to know that she did not have to allow her son to be victimized by the system, that we could fight this zero tolerance policy. And so it's so cool because she's just all over everywhere. And it's like, you know, the stuff I learned at Flick and the way that you can actually take on these systems and win for your child, but knowing that we need to take it and make it a larger thing. Because if they're doing it to one child, they're doing it to more. And so our families are really empowered. And on top of that, we'll do healing circles as well inside of that. But again, just knowing that we are empowered to fight this system and win is very helpful.
Thank you, Gina. 4 months in a village to stop a 5-year-old from getting suspended for some chapstick. But we're not being criminalized.
Right.
Yeah.
Come on, Dak.
So lately, and being here, right? I attended the healing workshop yesterday, and I think one of the things that really came to mind when thinking about healing was that actually our liberation lives in our trauma, right? And so that was very eye-opening for me, because it's understanding, right, that even though we don't have to share our stories every day, we do wake up in the same world every day, right, where we're constantly fighting for our mothers, for our sisters, for our brothers to get out of jail, right? And that is reliving trauma every day. So in thinking about that, some of the ways that we have developed the Trans Queer Pueblo to really support this everyday trauma is actually we have healing circles, right, all across the board on our 6 projects, making sure that we're sitting down with parents, right, because we have a family acceptance track where we teach parents about gender and sexual identity, right, and it's all in Spanish so that they're able to understand, but also that is rooted, right, that bypasses Christianity that was brought on by colonization and really focuses on our roots and the different genders that there were. And so we have healing circles. In health, in our health justice, we talk about building the cycle of health and healing the roots of injustice, right? So understanding that actually we don't need to be medicated. We need to have well-being in our lives, right? And that looks different for people. For some of us, it means like being able to run about 2 blocks, right, around the corner without being persecuted. We do art. Art is very healing, specifically for our LGBT community. Drag has been an important part of the work that we do at Trans Queer Pueblo, because it has allowed people to just really explore, right, with genders and with their gender and how they identify, and because we have a way to support them, some of the people who have started doing drag have identified that actually, you know what, I actually want to start my transition process, and because we have a clinic in place, we have been able to support them in their transition process, and that has been very healing, right? And so I think as I continue to be here and as I leave back home, I think that is the biggest question that I'm taking is how do we make sure that we're supporting our people when our liberation lives in our trauma?
Thank you.
So my elders have always told me you don't really know where you're going unless you know where you've been. So I'm going to ask you all to indulge me for a moment as we go back in time. I'm going to ask us and invite us to think comparatively in a social historical context and take it back to 1492. Y'all with me? All right. So in 1492, there was a clash between 2 irreconcilable worldviews. One, which I call the 3 Gs, which represents the worldview of the invader, the settler, the colonizer. The 3 Gs being greed, gold, and genocide, which can be expressed in contemporary terms as the capitalist mantra of maximize profits, minimize expenditures. And we value money before we value people. And then the indigenous worldview of all my relations. The Lakota say, mitaki asen. The Mayans say, in la kesh. Tu eres mi otro yo. You are a reflection of me and I'm a reflection of you. And the worldview of interconnectedness and interdependence. So as we talk about intersectionality, don't think we're coming up with something new. You know what I mean? Let's not get it twisted. All right, first of all. Second of all, as we begin to talk about healing, It's not like we should be searching for something new. For us, culture is our healing. It's our strength. It's our recovery. So for us, it's about returning, relearning, and reclaiming the traditional ways of our ancestors that kept us healthy since time immemorial, because our ceremonies and our culture were criminalized. If we're going to talk about criminalization, that was part of colonialism. And as a result of that, we have post-colonial stress disorder. My relatives of African descent got post-slave stress syndrome. And if we want to talk about the roots of prisons and policing, let's get into it for a quick minute. The first prisons were what? Slave plantation and the reservation. The first police were who? Slave catcher and the cavalry. So it's no coincidence now when we look at who makes up the majority of those incarcerated that it's folks of African descent and indigenous descent. And if y'all say, well, what about Latinos? Well, let's be real. That's not a race. Latinx is not a race. It's an ethnic identity. People who identify as Latinx are people of indigenous descent and African descent. And let's be real, there's a little European in there too, but we don't claim them because they don't claim us, so fuck them. All right? So right now, as we talk about healing work and healing justice, everybody and their grandma is talking about restorative justice. But what we're really talking about, the way it's being implemented right now, is cultural appropriation and co-optation. They take away this culture, they take away the ritual, they take away the ceremony, they put some chairs in a circle, they take a dollar store spatula and say, this is a talking piece? What the hell is sacred about that? Our young people recognize sacredness. In our traditional worldview, we know every young person is a blessing. Every young person has a sacred purpose. So all we have to do is lift up that mirror and let them see that sacredness in them. And relationships and intersectionality shouldn't be transactional. It's not just because we have a common pain. It's not just because we have a common oppression and we have a common struggle. It's because we are sacred and we are connected. We are relatives.
La cultura pura. Thank you, Arjun.
One of the things that Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities have struggled with for a long time is the invocation of national security. So we combat criminalization of our communities and securitization of our communities. And I think it's important to remember, as has been acknowledged at the stage, this didn't begin with Trump. It won't end with Trump. It began well before 9/11. It intensified after 9/11. And we have what we have today. So for example, thinking about something like watch lists. Anybody who is intuitive should understand that watch lists don't make sense. The premise of a watch list is that you are too dangerous to fly, but not dangerous enough to arrest. Doesn't make sense. And the criteria is so broad that the US government can brand you a terrorist on the basis of a single social media post. Dearborn, Michigan, a city with a population of less than 100,000 residents, has more watch-listed residents than any other city in the country except for New York. And up until very recently, it was impossible to know if you were on a watch list, why you were on a watch list, to contest being on a watch list, and any type of remedies for that. Thinking about programs like CVE, Countering Violent Extremism programs. These are programs that try to identify Muslim Americans who are at risk of one day becoming violent extremists. The fact of the matter is that these programs are based on junk science. Anybody who's actually looked at the process of violent radicalization has found that there are no universal indicators that can predict when somebody might one day in the future become a violent extremist. So in the absence of those universal indicators, the government has basically made up indicators that allow them to criminalize our community, profile our communities, and surveil our communities. So the indicators they use are literally things like a newfound interest in religiosity, joining a Muslim charity, being confrontational at home. We've had situations where young Muslim men will grow beards or Muslim women will wear hijabs. And all of a sudden they will be visited by law enforcement because there is a perception that they are on the path of violent radicalization. Of course, everything that I just described is constitutionally protected activity, and it certainly isn't an indicator of violent extremism. And then thinking, of course, about the present moment. You have the Muslim ban, you have the refugee ban. And the work that we're doing to heal, I think the first is just fighting back. Fighting back is very important for our communities. Transparency. In so many cases, we actually don't even know how we are being targeted because of the national security frame. There can be no reconciliation without accountability. And ways in which also we're pushing back. So on October 10th, the Supreme Court's going to be hearing oral arguments in the Muslim ban litigation. The Security and Rights Collaborative has provided rapid response grants to 8 to 10 groups across the country who are pushing back against that program in different ways. So Project South in Atlanta is actually going to hold a tribunal, People versus Trump, where people who are impacted from these 6 Muslim banned countries and refugees are going to come forward and talk about their stories. At Borough Hall in New York, there's actually going to be a dance where people actually stomp out the Muslim ban. The other point that I will make, and I think this is something that's also come up in the last couple of days, and I think we just need to be honest with ourselves about it, is that a lot of our communities are experiencing primary trauma. Either it's because of history, it's because of contemporary criminalization, it's contemporary hate, but in so many ways, so are the people who work with them. So I also think we need to be having a very serious conversation on how we deal with issues of secondary trauma,
Yes.
and how we make sure that we are also protecting, leaders who work with impacted people and organizers as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I wanted to ask another question. How are people funding outside the structures that are criminalizing our communities, right? How are people funding to support the communities for success? Does anyone want to share on that?
Well, I think I'll try to take a stab at that. So I think what always seems to be a stressor for us is that when some of the same foundations that fund our work that's moving to end mass incarceration looks at funding government. And I'm always perplexed by that, because it's like, how would it be that the same folks that uphold laws that criminalize our children will actually then be the savior and help us fix it? And then, so I'm not going to say what program that is locally, but so it's just really very interesting when that happens. And then folks who are on the front line, like Flick, are not necessarily included in that process, right? So I think that's just really hard for us to understand how that happens, and really wish it didn't. And but funding us for success, I think, multi-year funding is always really good. I believe we need more of that, because especially as we're working with impacted family members and young people, that for the long haul is really, really helpful and necessary.
Thank you, Gina. I'm going to let Julia jump in there after this. I'm just going to mention some of the things that we do at CJI. So one of the things we do at CJI is we don't have a max on the number of grants an organization can receive, right? So there are some grantees that are new. This may be their first year. There are some grantees that have received grants for 10 years and then didn't for 2 years and then got some more for another 3 years. Basically, the bottom line is, are you strengthening the movement? Are you effective in the work that you're planning to do? Okay, that's the determination on to whether you're eligible for receive a grant, not some arbitrary determination that we made on how many years, we want to be with you in partnership as we, fight this terrible monster. And another thing is general support grants. So we believe that the people on the ground are the ones who know what they need the money for to get what done. And if we agree that the work that they're doing is critical and they're doing a good job doing it, then we're going to let them have the power to determine how they best need to use those funds, especially if they're receiving funds from other organizations, from other funders that are more prescriptive. We give them general support funds, because then they can fill in those gaps that they're not getting, and they can use it for some of the more radical work that they're doing. So that's another important thing that I think we need to make really clear. And then the last thing is that we just went through another process this week, Bridgette Butler, our deputy director, on streamlining the application process, right? Reducing the number of questions so we can get to the thick of it easier, quicker for our applicants, so they don't have to spend as much time answering a lot of tedious questions that basically amount to the same thing. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we need the money for. Please give it to us. The only other critical thing that I think is important to note is that for us, it's really important to say, you are not working in a silo. So you might be like the most phenomenal organization out there doing the work that you're doing. There might not even be another organization doing exactly that part of the work that you're doing. But if you're not doing it in some sort of alliance, in some sort of network, in some sort of coalition, then there's going to be a limitation to how effective you can be. And so for us, what's the other critical important thing for us to know is that you're working with other people. You're working alongside other folks. And so that's those are three things that we think are really important. And that's kind of like what we try to keep in mind when we're doing our grant making, because we are trying to maximize what we think is going to be the most effective for the movement. Sorry, so I said Julia and then George.
When I think about healing justice, a couple things come to mind. Repairing harm and making amends. And, you know, there's much more to healing justice, but those two things, there's another word for that. It could be summed up by reparations, right? I'm not working on the front line like these folks, but in a philanthropic context where I do work, what that looks like is, one, cutting the check and letting folks just do what they need to do to meet community needs. Cutting the check and getting out of the way, right? But it also means investing in movements and organizations' ability to resource themselves. It means, you know, rethinking our traditional ways and how we see philanthropy as giving, as sort of a charitable thing, as a charity, and, you know, thinking about how we are resourcing the self-determination of organizations, of people, and of movements. One of the things that we are investing in with the Black-Led Movement Fund is the ability for the Movement for Black Lives Resource Table, which is a community-controlled fund, which is managed by leaders of the movement, to be able to resource themselves and investing in their ability to experiment with some new resource generation models, some new business development models that are rooted in sort of an anti-capitalist, you know, like sort of shared power framework, but investing in their ability to be able to resource themselves. Because what philanthropy often is short-term, it's episodic, it's fickle, it's unlikely or unwilling to invest in the kinds of non-traditional organizational formations that actually do help get our people free, the C4s, the healing work, the work around trauma, right? Too often we are forcing grantees to be operating in a very, narrow box, and we're not acknowledging all the ways in which, you know, communities need to, you know, their organizations need to be fed before they can fight. So, you know, one of the things that I think is really critical is for us to be thinking about how we are supporting organizations to be less reliant on traditional mainstream white philanthropy, which again, right, the roots of that is pretty dirty. Right? And so making amends really means, you know, doing what we can do to use philanthropy as a tool, right? Philanthropy is not going to get people free, right? But it is a tool to invest in the ability of movements to be able to do that work for themselves. And so that's how we really are thinking about sort of like healing and repairing harm in the philanthropic context, because there are so many ways in which we as funders are traumatizing grantees.
Say that again.
Funders, we are traumatizing our grantees in terms of the kinds of hoops that we're making them jump through, the ways in which, you know, we are not providing them with the kind of support that white mainstream organizations oftentimes get. Right? Let's look at like all the money that's coming out, you know, post, you know, November, right? Movements who have been on the ground, who have been leading this work for centuries, right? Who have the solutions inside of their communities are not being recognized. Their work is not being validated, right? So, you know, that's an important framework for us as we're thinking about how are we repairing the harm that we often do as funders to communities who are really fighting for all of our collective liberation.
Thank you. George, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to expand on the healing justice question and also contribute something in terms of how we repair some of the harm that philanthropy has done in terms of communities. So I want to talk once again about restorative justice, because I did mention it was culturally appropriated and something that's been co-opted. And what I want to really kind of share, the traditional definition of restorative justice is really just about rebalancing. You know, and this is part of natural law. Rebalancing is something we always understood just as part of a duality from an indigenous worldview. And it's not necessarily a negative thing. Western culture, you know, when a harm occurs, that's one way that things can get unbalanced. And what we're really, our goal is to rebalance after that. Western culture is consumed with blame, shame, guilt, repression, and punishment. From an indigenous worldview, we know anytime there's an unbalance, there's actually a learning opportunity. That's how growth and development occurs. I believe there was a sister on the panel who talked about some of the controlled burns in California, Indian country. And that was something many of our ancestors did, and that was part of a way of creating regrowth for a forest in order to create a healthy forest, right? And so think about our communities, think about our families as an ecosystem. And sometimes that's all with that unbalance that was created is an opportunity for growth and development. You know, and we operate from a philosophy of the 4 laws of change. You know, the first law is that change comes from within. Knowledge is innate. Everything we need to know is already inside us. It's internal. The second law of change is that it must be preceded by a vision. We had traditional ceremonies for that. But psychologists will tell you that you have to be able to see something in order for it to be actualized, right? You have to visualize it. You know, the third law of change is that a great learning must occur. And so that's what I'm referring to. And if we don't learn that lesson when a harm occurs or when there's unbalance, then guess what? We're going to keep repeating that. You know what I mean? One of the deficits of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome. And the last law of change is to create a healing forest. And that's understanding that we are an ecosystem, that we are interconnected, that we are interdependent. And if you think about the roots right now of the forest and thinking about our communities as a forest, and you think about all the different kinds of harms that are contributing to that, think about all the things, all the beautiful things that heal us and how we replace that and how we create a healing forest in our communities. So I say that much because oftentimes research, philanthropy, and a whole lot of other entities that have good intentions can come in and actually recolonize communities of color. And so what I will say in terms of the work that I'm very focused on, I very much welcome and invite a lot of the celebrity interest now in the issues of mass incarceration, state violence, and criminalization. And I'm very excited that there have been some foundation executives that have taken positions on that, bold positions recently. What I want to caution y'all about is trying to lead the work. And the investments also in celebrities who are now developing their own nonprofits that instead of bringing in new resources from funding streams that maybe we'd never had access to are actually consuming resources from y'all at the expense of the folks on the ground who've been directly impacted. And running your own communications campaigns when you don't have a base and you aren't going to mobilize folks to back up when shit hits the fan. That's some of the issues that I'm identifying right now, right? And so we're going to continue to do this work when y'all move on to whatever you think is sexy next. So how are you building the leadership of those who are directly impacted? That's the question I have for y'all. So,
Yes, Arjun.
One area that I think is particularly challenging is the issue of hate violence. So for a long time, I think it's fair to say, the vast majority of community groups, when there was a hate crime, would immediately sort of spring into action, reach out to law enforcement, and ask for hate crime charges to be brought. Increasingly, groups are trying to figure out ways that they can sort of work outside that or work and sort of complement to that. So there are a lot of organizations now who are receiving funding to do things like self-defense, neighborhood watch programs, community defense programs, to build sanctuary, and then also in terms of preparation, to have actually a hate crime task force that don't include law enforcement. So again, understanding that there may be a time and place where we need to bring in law enforcement, but also understanding that these are the same institutions that are also criminalizing our communities. If our response is to just sort of myopically trust them, you know, we're compounding the problem in different ways.
Thank you very much for that. So we only have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to ask each of our presenters here to share with us one thing that they would suggest to this community of philanthropists that could support the work that you're doing that's not presently being done or that should be highlighted. One thing that these folks can take home with them that will help them understand how to strengthen our communities.
Simple. Trust Black and Indigenous people's leadership.
Okay.
I think my one thing would be recognize that building leadership takes a long time, and that and again, what you're saying, trusting what's coming from the field. Don't just say, don't take it and then not move on what it is that we say we actually need.
I would say that it is important to trust people, right? I think trust Black, Brown, Indigenous, and queer communities to actually know what they're doing and to actually understand that we need to invest in people, not campaigns, and that is where change happens. In transformation, right?
Yes.
Because change can change back, and that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a lot of the policy that was taken out re-emerge, right? So we need to start transforming, and it starts by actually doing work on the ground and really trusting the communities to know what they're doing, right? And also in thinking about supporting, it is very easy to fund big organizations that have flashy campaigns. I challenge all of you to actually do the work, to go on the ground, to really look at the small organizations that are actually doing the work, because it is I can't tell you how many people. For example, here in New Orleans, Women with a Vision, look them up, love them, Women with a Vision and Breakout. So just do that, and if you don't know about Trans Queer Pueblo, hey, we're here. We need funding.
So punctuate the points that were just made, and to say to not do so is essentially to reproduce systems of oppression in a so-called anti-oppression movement. It's like akin to having a freedom bus and white folks trying to drive the bus and relegate Black folks to the back of the bus still. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's how messed up it is when you don't invest in the leadership of those who are directly impacted. So thank you.
I would say de-emphasize litigation, and I'm saying that as a civil rights lawyer. Laws can be rewritten, judges can be replaced, but community leaders and resilience can't.
Thank you. I want to thank you so much for your really attentive listening, and I want you to think seriously about what you've heard today and to think about what it is that you can do in your organization, in your philanthropic organization, to move closer toward these points that you've heard today, right? Not to just hear them resounding in your head and saying, yeah, we heard that before, but to really commit yourself to moving the needle forward within your organization to make this a reality as opposed to just really good talking points. So I'm gonna challenge you to do that today. Thank you so much, and we appreciate you.